1325 on women, peace and security. Let's take you there now.
Women in some countries are at greatest physical risk where they should be safest, in their own homes. Their chances of suffering violence may be equivalent to or higher than in a war zone. The COVID-19 pandemic has only increased this threat. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda challenges the relentless focus on interstate conflict at the expense of measures to protect women. In the past 20 years, academic research and practice have demonstrated the close links between gender equality, conflict prevention, and peace. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda calls for a broader consideration of ways to prevent conflict, prevent gender-based violence, and to create peaceful, inclusive communities and societies. As we recover from the pandemic, we face a choice: to continue down the path of increasing militarization, conflict, and intergenerational losses, or to work towards greater inclusion, equality, and prevention of conflicts and crises of all kinds. For governments and international institutions everywhere, gender equality is one of the surest ways of building social cohesion and trust, and inspiring people to be responsible, participating citizens. Mr. President, for the women mediators, peace builders, human rights defenders, and essential workers who risk their lives to build peace, for the millions of women, men, girls, and boys whose hopes for peace and security rest on more equal and just societies, we cannot wait another 20 years to implement the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Let's start that work together today, and I thank you.
Я благодарю генерального секретаря за его брифинг. Насколько мы понимаем, в 11 часов генеральному секретарю необходимо уйти, чтобы принять участие в другом мероприятии. И мы хотели бы вновь поблагодарить его за участие в сегодняшнем заседании. А сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Фумзиле Мламбангукка.
Mr. President, we had her on the screen before, but it seems that we have lost her. Perhaps to go to the next briefer until we get her back.
Я так и сделаю, и сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Данай Гурири.
To inspire the audience. But in your privileged position, as members of the Security Council, you get to hear directly from real-life heroes. I would like to take my time here today to pay homage to them and make sure you do not forget their stories.
Hello? She's the lady from the film, right? The Black Panther.
From what?
From the Black Panther movie. Remember that Black Panther?
Can I request to switch off all the mics? We have an echo sound. I think it's Ms. Mlambanguka microphone. Please switch off. Ms. Gurira, please continue.
Oh, okay. Thank you. When we tell stories on a page, a stage, or the screen, we often use our heroes to inspire the audience. But in your privileged position as members of the Security Council, you get to hear directly from real-life heroes. I would like to take my time here today to pay homage to them and make sure that you do not forget their stories. Earlier this year, you heard from Wafa al-Saidi in Yemen, who regularly crosses the conflict front lines to provide medical assistance to mothers whose children have survived so many bombings that they are now fearful of the sound of rain. In a meeting like this, she asked you to put an end to the direct and indirect support to military operations in Yemen. You have had the opportunity to meet Nujeen Mustafa, a young Syrian woman born with cerebral palsy and famous for traveling from Syria to Germany in a steel wheelchair. Speaking on behalf of women with disabilities in wars everywhere, she told you, nothing about us without us. She is one of the 10 Syrian women from civil society that have addressed this Security Council in the last year and a half. You heard from Clemencia Carabali, who has been defending the rights of Afro-Colombians for almost a quarter of a century, and had recently survived yet another assassination attempt. She told you that women are being killed for defending the human rights and territories of their communities, and she gave you names, dates, and details. There was Ridal Al-Touboli from Libya, who lost many activist friends, but refuses to be stopped or silenced. When she's not teaching at the University of Tripoli, she spends every minute she has mobilizing women and calling out men in power to let women take their rightful seat at the table. She told you that in the name of preventative diplomacy and state building, the international community often supports troublemakers instead of peace builders, and gives power and legitimacy to violent minorities instead of empowering the peaceful majority, which is an eloquent summary of what women, peace, and security is all about. You listened to the bright and talented Ilwad Elman, a young Somali woman whose family escaped the civil war after the killing of their father, a human rights activist. She managed to make a life for herself in Canada, yet decided to come back to her country of birth alongside her two sisters, all three of them determined to help peace in Somalia. Ilwad told you that peace talks that focus on warlords and reconciliation processes that mainly engage political leaders while excluding women-led civil society groups are doomed to fail. The last time that Russia resided over an annual debate on women, peace, and security 4 years ago, you invited Rita Lapidia from South Sudan to brief the Security Council on a day like today. When she was 7 years old, Rita would run to the riverbank on the Nile to stay away from the shelling and the artillery drowning out all the other sounds in her native Juba. And yet, like Ilwad Iman, even though she was able to escape the war, she came back to her country as a young woman to organize thousands of women for peace and contribution directly to peace negotiations. She asked you to put pressure on parties to include women, not just in peace talks, but in all the mechanisms set up to implement and monitor these agreements. And she said, South Sudan is becoming a living hell for a lot of women. And in my opinion, this should not be happening on your watch. This was 4 years ago. Excellencies, one of the things that these real-life heroes have in common is the conviction that inclusion is our only way in these dark times, and that equality between men and women in decision-making is the only way we will build peace. The United Nations and this Security Council have been pushing this idea for the last 20 years. And there has been some progress, but not nearly enough. 0.2% of aid for women's organizations is not good enough. 19% of seats in parliament in conflict countries is not good enough. Male-dominated rooms in the 21st century should be embarrassing to all, not least to the men in those rooms. $1.9 trillion in military spending is not making us safer today. The stories of these real-life heroes are inspiring, but they should have more support from everyone else. Most of the times, when women make their mark in spite of impossible odds, it's not because they were given the space or the opportunity, but because they protested against their exclusion and persisted. Liberian women went so far as barricading a hotel full of warlords and preventing them from leaving until they signed a peace accord after 14 years of gruesome civil war. Women like them will continue to rise and to fight for peace. But they should not be doing that on their own. Even at this time of enormous uncertainty and loss of the trust of authorities and institutions, people expect global unity and multilateral cooperation more than ever. Women that you have been inviting have been inspiring stories and have had a powerful message. It is now your turn to show that you've been listening. And just like they keep showing up for peace, it's your turn to show up for them. Thank you.
Я благодарю госпожу Данай Гурели за ее брифинг. Я ожидаю появления госпожи Фумзили Мламба Нгука. Она в процессе подключения. Ну, наверное, я передам слово следующему бриферу, когда Мламба Нгука подключится к нам. Я предоставляю слово госпоже Наталье Емельяновой.
Secretary General, Mr. President, distinguished delegates, it's an honor to address the Security Council and present the Secretary General's reports on women, peace and security on the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325. The resolution was born out of the horrors committed against the bodies of women and girls in Bosnia, Rwanda, and the example set by women who fought for their representation in Northern Ireland, in Southern Africa, and Central America. These were impossible to ignore. In 1995, the UN convened nearly 50,000 women in Beijing, China, where women stated that women's rights are human rights and forced attention to institutionalize gender inequality. Since then, the legacy of these women and their struggle has been carried on proudly by the Colombian women who made peace and history in Havana, the women who led the negotiations to end Asia's longest insurgency in the Philippines, the women in Kosovo who fought for nearly 2 decades to get reparations for what had been done to them, the Liberian women who were not invited to the peace talks but crushed the place, and their presence made a difference, the Afghan women who came out of the oppression of the Taliban to never again accept the will of the Taliban, the women in many countries whose brave testimonies aimed to put their abusers in the docks of international courts. The United Nations has taken notice and actively supported these women. It has devoted increased attention and resources to boost the leadership of women who are affected by conflict and to address the atrocities committed against them. For example, 40% of the peace-building funds investments in 2019 supported gender-responsive peace building. The Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund was created on the 50th anniversary of this resolution, and it is now supporting more than 200 women's organizations on the ground in many countries. For 2 decades, we have been saying we need more women in peacekeeping. So I encourage all countries to support the ELSI initiative designed to incentivize increased participation of uniformed women in peace operation. But despite all these good initiatives and progress, we are still falling short. Evidence shows that peace processes that involve women are key to long-term and lasting peace. Yet, women are still systematically excluded, confined to informal processes, or relegated to the role of spectators while men sit in the room that will define their lives and decide everyone's future. In peace negotiations from 1992 to 2019, only 13% of negotiators, 16% of mediators, and 6% of peace agreement signatories were women. The negotiations are still structured in a way that elevates and empowers the actors that have fueled violence rather than empowering those constituencies who are peace builders, making exclusion and impunity the norm. We have seen now in Nigeria 250 girls disappear from a school and a community in the most shocking act of defiance and provocation. The world failed to bring back our girls, a real tragedy that I personally still feel pained by. Voices of women and civil society have brought the atrocities against women and girls out of the silence of history and put them on record. But we are yet to see justice and to witness consequences for those who committed these atrocities. We are yet to see Daesh or Boko Haram prosecuted for crimes committed against women. We had to wait until last year to see the first ever successful conviction for sexual and gender-based violence at the International Criminal Courts. The women are trapped in the men's wars and have surplus of support in words and statements, but they have a funding drought. They are still left to fend for themselves, with beautiful words remaining just words. Our latest figures show that the percentage of funding to conflict-affected countries that goes to programs whose principal objective is to advance gender equality has declined to 4.5%. But only a quarter of them also has gone into programs that are saving lives of women. Our latest figures also show that the funds to women declined and that only 1.5% was received by women who are in experiencing violence in conflict. So the reports of the SG looks ahead as we enter the new decade. It sets out 5 overarching goals for the next decade of our work in women, peace and security. Goal 1 is on meaningful participation, calls for a radical shift and tangible results in women's equal and meaningful participation in peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. This must be a non-negotiable priority for the UN. The UN and member states who facilitate peace processes must always include women in their own delegation so that we can lead by example. Goal 2, the unconditional defense of women's rights, which has to be the most visible and identifiable markers of the UN's work of peace and security, and standing with women human rights defenders. The UN should step up its efforts to protect the human rights defenders. If suppressing women's rights is the hallmark of conflict parties, the UN must be the loudest voice in their defense and make the fewest compromises. In all conversation I have with women's civil society organization about women's rights, they start or finish with concerns about women's sexual and reproductive rights and widespread violence against women. For women to play a role in decision-making in society, they need to be able to decide about their own bodies and must have no impunity but must see that impunity of men against women is tackled decisively. Goal 3, a reversal of upward trajectory in global military spending. This has always been a chief strategic objective of the women's movement for peace. Last year, global expenditure reached $1.9 trillion, following the largest annual increase in a decade, while governments are struggling to find the social infrastructure and essential services that underpin human security. Goal 4, a minimum 15% of official development assistance to conflict-affected countries should be dedicated to advancing gender equality, including multiplying by 5 the direct assistance to women's organizations. Without investment in women, our talk will remain talk. Goal 5, the report calls for gender data revolution that reaches the general public and increases our knowledge around today's most pressing issues and the new security environment, from pandemics and climate change to the growing power of private security actors and new technologies. So as we make these strides to close the gender data in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, we must close the gap also in the area of women, peace, and security. 2020 is the most difficult year for humanity. We have to resolve to protect gains made and rebuild back better after the pandemic. And worldwide lockdowns have exposed the deep inequalities in education, health system, and economic opportunities. We have been shown the enormous value of unpaid care and domestic work as enablers of economies, and how disproportionately this burden is falling on the shoulders of women. In conflict settings, women perform 3 to 7 times as much unpaid care work as men, and girls' education is at risk in many places as they face the threat of forced marriage. We have also seen the shadow pandemic of violence against women that is at all-time high, prompting the Secretary General to call on all governments to address gender-based violence with renewed vigor. And all this means women, peace, and security agenda just got bigger. Excellencies, 20 years ago, this Council embraced the long-standing claims of women's movement about women's leadership in conflict, and then made this to be a global norm by adopting Resolution 1325. At this point, we need to consider the implementation deficit and address especially the implementation gap that impacts on people's lives. We also need to ensure that the Secretary General's calls for an immediate global ceasefire is heeded. Women have amplified the Secretary General's call in all parts of the world as they battle to survive the pandemic and effects of conflict. Women are also struggling for healthcare, childcare, jobs, and shelter. These challenges are even worse for women in displaced and conflict areas. Women constitute the bulk of frontline healthcare workers everywhere in the world and are highly represented in the hard-hit sectors of the economy. Many will not regain pre-pandemic economic activity. This is the experience from the Ebola pandemic, because there is no gender-neutral pandemic. Yet, women are underrepresented in pandemic decision making, and this is worse for women in conflict areas. In war zones and everywhere in the world, women and people are calling for inclusion and representation, which is one of the main reasons why so many ordinary people are taking to the streets, organizing protests and raising their voices. Young women and young peace builders are ready to work. They want change and they want to be included. The many young women who are out there do not want to be bystanders. They want to be involved, people who are making changes. They cannot accept the slow pace of progress, and they cannot accept the possibility of reversal. They know that there is too much at stake, as we know too in this august house. After 25 years of implementing the Beijing Platform for Action, we have unfulfilled dreams that we need now to focus on. Hence, we have mobilized multiple stakeholders to fast-track the implementation of 1325 and the Beijing Declaration through generation equality as part of our commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. UN Women, member states, civil society, youth, individuals have developed a compact on women, peace and security and humanitarian to bring everyone together to assist in pushing implementation and getting results and ensuring accountability. We have a rich normative framework, and we thank this House, amongst others, for their contribution towards this dispensation. But going forward, we need to move more to leveraging effectively this normative framework to improve implementation with a focus to look forward to a decade of action that will be a decade of change that is irreversible and long-lasting to women. We look forward to a peace and security agenda that brings benefit to women and girls fast rather than slow, because each day is a day lost. The leadership of this council is invaluable and is much needed in the achievement of international peace and security that benefits women and girls as they emerge from the pandemic. Excellencies, happy 20th anniversary.
Я благодарю госпожу Миламу Нбуко за ее брифинг, и сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Наталье Емельяновой.
All right, the UN Security Council marks 20 years of women, peace and security. That's the open debate currently on Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. Just heard from Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, Executive Director of UN Women, raising some really important issues, and perhaps an issue that we might have forgotten in the past, the fact that 250 girls were sort of disappeared in Nigeria, and saying that the world actually failed to bring back our girls, and talking about girls' education being at a risk in many parts of the world as young girls are forced to marry young. You also heard from actress from Black Panther, Danai Gurira. Really, they're representing Africa at that UN Security Council debate that's on at the moment. Right, let's take a short break. Do stay with us here on SA Today.